Amateur Traveler is in its 20th year now, but can you imagine if I had people on the show who had never been to the destination, but had just read about it or seen a movie about it? That wouldn't make any sense at all, and you wouldn't listen. We all know how important it is to receive advice from people who know a destination to get the most authentic local experience. And a great option for experiencing this is Explore Worldwide and their authentic small group adventures, led by local tour leaders, perfect for solo travelers who want to meet like minded people with a desire for adventure. I'm often an independent traveler, but two of my last three trips were with small group tours because they organize everything and it's a lot easier. If you want to recreate the tour I did to Malta, they have a Malta and Gozo Discovery Tour. I'm intrigued by one of their tours called A Taste of Sicily. The company again is Explore Worldwide, and visit exploreworldwide.com to learn more. And thanks to Explore Worldwide for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler. The nights are long, the days are short, and the weather is chilly to downright cold, depending on where you are. It's a good time to slip into a Quince iconic Mongolian cashmere sweaters, which start at only $50. You can treat yourself to everyday luxury at an affordable price with Quince. If you really want to dive into luxury, you can check out their leather handbags, washable silk shirts, and European linen sheet sets. Whatever you're looking for at Quince, all the prices are 50 to 80% less than similar brands, and they do that by partnering directly with top factories and cutting out the middleman. They only work with factories that use safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing processes. And of course, they use premium fabrics and finishes for that luxury feel in every piece. But you've already heard me rave about my Quince travel pants. Treat yourself this winter without the luxury price tag. Go to quince.com/traveler for 365-day returns plus free shipping on your order. That's QUINCE.com/traveler to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/traveler. And thanks to Quince for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler. Amateur Traveler, episode 163. Today, the Amateur Traveler goes to the Yucatan Peninsula. Hear about Mayan ruins, colonial cities, and just lying on the beach in this tropical paradise. Today on the Amateur Traveler. Welcome to the Amateur Traveler. I'm your host, Chris Christensen. Before we get into today's interview, I do have two news stories for you. The first one is the coolest one, and that is that Egypt is planning an underwater museum. You may or may not be aware that in the harbor at Alexandria, there are ruins, including perhaps the ruins of the Lighthouse of Alexandria, that have fallen into the harbor. And rather than take them all up and put them in a museum someplace, UNESCO, along with the Egyptian government, are planning to show that in place, in situ, in the harbor in Alexandria. Makes me want to go get scuba certified. And the second news story might become a familiar one this year if times continue to get tough for the airlines. Northwest flight attendants are suing, but they're suing Delta. They're trying to prevent the merger of the two airlines. I'm not sure that's really going to help as airlines are doing poorly. We're probably going to have fewer airlines after this year. And so it's either going to be mergers or somebody going out of business. So links to both of those news stories, as well as a couple other ones, you can find in the show notes at amateurtraveler.com. I'd like to welcome back to the show Zora O'Neil, who's come to talk to us about the Yucatan in Mexico. Zora, welcome back to the show.
Thanks so much. Happy to be here.
I say welcome back to the show because Zora talked to us before about New Mexico and has just written, or just published, I guess is true. You probably wrote some time ago, the Rough Guide to the Yucatan.
Yes,
so.
That's a time-lapse in travel guide writing. This is actually the second edition of the Rough Guide to the Yucatan that just came out. So I'm co-author on it actually with John Fisher, and he and I worked on the first edition about 3 years ago and have had a chance to really spruce it up again this time around.
Now, as a travel writer, when you are doing something like this, are you writing a guide because you get the opportunity to, and then therefore you go and learn the location, or was this a location you were already in love with?
Well, it's funny. It's been so long. I've been working on the Yucatan. I've been visiting the Yucatan for travel guide work for about 5 years, so it's sort of hard to remember when I wasn't familiar with the place. My original assignment from Rough Guides was to update the Yucatan chapter of their Mexico book, and at that point, I didn't really know all that much about the place. I'd fantasized about taking a big car trip around the Yucatan, and I had some contacts there, and they said, "That's great, go." So that first trip was really a crash course, but now I've been going down there at least once a year, sometimes 2 and 3 times a year ever since then. So
now with Mexico driving, combining the words car trip and crash course sounds a little scary to me.
No, not at all. It's actually really funny. I do remember when I left for my first trip, I had booked 6 weeks and I was going alone. I was a little bit scared. And once I was down there, I really had to laugh. You hear so many sort of horror stories about Mexico and driving especially, and terrible conditions of roads and bandits and policemen who are going to try and give you tickets for nothing. And I have encountered absolutely none of that. Actually, the roads in the Yucatan are all stellar. There are no bandits as far as I have ever encountered or even heard of. And the policemen are exceedingly polite. It's actually been great. And no crashes, so none at all.
Well, a while back, and this has been a little while since they've changed, I understood that, especially in Mexico City area, that people, when driving at night, found that they could see better if they left their lights off. They could see the lights of the other guy. Of course, that doesn't translate very well to large groups of people, so I haven't seen that recently, so I think they've...
I think there's a nice little etiquette, actually, in when you enter a village, everybody switches off their main headlights and just leaves on their parking lights so as not to blind the passersby, which I find very polite, but it does require more vigilance from drivers. And, of course, assuming the other drivers have been careful to leave their parking lights on. So, yeah, but driving after dark, maybe not the greatest idea, because also another sort of common hazard on the road in the Yucatan is people riding bicycles. Often you're on very, very narrow roads. And usually people go out hunting at dusk, and so you'll encounter these bicycles sort of loaded down with all kinds of stuff and guys with guns, and maybe they have a little animal draped over the back and stuff. So it's better to be wherever you want to be before the sun sets, just so you don't overlap too much with random hunters and things like that.
So if someone was going to come down to Yucatan, I say come down because clearly I'm up in the U.S., and they had only, say, a week or 2 weeks, they didn't have 6 weeks to drive all around, what kind of itinerary would you recommend?
Well, you can see a lot. Often people get a little bit beguiled by the coast, and I mean the Caribbean coast there is beautiful,
sure,
like legendarily gorgeous, and it is really easy just to waste away a week lying on the beach. Not to waste at all. I mean, it's a lovely place to be. But if you're diligent, you can drive inland. Most people, I say drive inland because most people come in through Cancun. It's where most of the flights are and where you're likely to get the best airfare deals. The biggest city on the Yucatan Peninsula, which is Merida, also gets a few flights from the United States, mostly via Houston and some from Miami. So you can fly in there if you want to sort of go straight to the sort of inland colonial vibe, and that can be convenient, but the airfares usually aren't so cheap. But the convenient thing is that the drive between Cancun and Merida is only about 4 hours, so you're not talking about a tremendous amount of ground to cover. And you can make a nice, pretty easy loop just by driving inland from Cancun. Chichen Itza is there about 2 hours in, and then it's another 2 hours to Merida. And there's a beautiful colonial city on the Gulf Coast called Campeche, which you can loop down to, and then just do a little meandering drive back southwest. There's a whole bunch of ruins south of Merida that are great to visit. And then you can come back around to the coast at around Talum, say, and come back up to Cancun. And you could do that pretty easily in a week if you were not too lazy and easily distracted like I can be. It's nicer to give yourself 10 days because the Yucatan is a very, very mellow place that's contagious. So once you get there, you can easily spend an afternoon doing nothing on a plaza. So between a week and 10 days is a good amount of time, and you do get a chance to sort of soak up some of the more rural atmosphere there as well.
And so it does sound like you are recommending to rent a car in Cancun and drive?
I would say it gives you the most flexibility. Okay. It's certainly not necessary. There's excellent bus coverage. People will be blown away by the quality of the sort of deluxe first-class buses in Mexico now beat the pants off any airline you might fly on these days. You get a very nice movie, you get your personal headphones, you get somebody giving you coffee and tea and a little snack. It's seat reclines all the way. So there's actually a really great express bus between Cancun and Merida that's still quite cheap even when you go at the best class. And even when you get out in more rural areas, there's still really excellent bus coverage. It just takes a little bit more planning. And if you do want to visit the ruins south of Merida, that area is usually called the Ruta Puc because the area is called the Puc Hills, and all the ruins there are sort of the same style. So if you want to do that area south of Merida, which is kind of an easy little day trip loop, that's usually the one place I'd recommend getting a car. So it's often you can go between the major cities on buses and then maybe take, if you want to cut down your car time, then maybe rent a car for an overnight and go down to the Puc area south of Merida and do a little loop around. And that way you can go from ruin to ruin to ruin in a day without having to wait for a bus.
And how many different ruins are in that area then?
Let's see, Uxmal is the main one down there. That's sort of the second biggest set of ruins aside from Chichen Itza in the Yucatan. So Uxmal is the biggie, and that's about an hour south of Merida. And then past that, there are 4 or 5 other little ruins, and they're some of the most intricately carved and crazily decorated. They're kind of small in area and buildings, but the decoration there is really exceptional. And so you can go from sort of, there's some really great huge pyramids at Uxmal, sort of smaller buildings in their surrounding area. A lot of those are sort of tucked away in the greenery and so much more hidden away. So it's kind of a good balance where you see the majestic and also the intricate detail.
And I'm assuming we're talking about Mayan ruins.
Yes. Sorry, I guess I should specify. Give the basics. There's so many pre-Columbian cultures in Mexico.
Right.
Empire after empire kind of thing. It's easy to lose track. But yeah, the Maya Empire took over the entire Yucatan Peninsula and was also down in Guatemala as well, and Belize. And some of the biggest ruins are actually down in Guatemala, and some of, I would say, the absolute coolest ruins in the Yucatan Peninsula are actually the ones that are closest to the Guatemala border and the hardest to get to. They are way down south in an area that hardly anybody goes to, in the middle of a biosphere reserve. They're called Calakmul. And they're in another area where also there are many surrounding small ruins, so you can make a little trip down there. But Calakmul is huge city, and they've only excavated kind of a tiny part of it. And you drive down for about an hour through the middle of this biosphere reserve on a one-lane road, and the one-lane road is filled with like wild turkeys blocking the way, so it takes a while, and you're always having to stop for wildlife, and you hear the howler monkeys out in the distance, and there are crazy birds flying in front of your car. And you finally get down there, and basically the center of it is this tremendous one huge pyramid, and you climb up to the top of the pyramid, and you see nothing but greenery to every horizon, and it's with sort of no intervening sign of civilization, which is really a tremendous feeling. The Yucatan is not very heavily populated, but pretty much every half an hour or so you'll hit a small town. So if you're just driving around, you still feel like you're in the middle of everything. But it's amazing how just driving an hour off the highway will suddenly get you into the middle of some of the densest jungle in Mexico. It's really a great side trip. So I'd say that's the pinnacle of the Maya stuff, but certainly the least accessible. Worth the trip if you're really into that. But there are many more accessible ruins up in the northern part of the peninsula as well.
Now, you mentioned the beaches, which, of course, a lot of people are going down there for. Anything we should know? I want to almost move on from the beaches, but I really should pause there and say, what should we know about going to the beach in the Yucatan?
Well, the area that's getting the most press these days is the area called the Riviera Maya, which is basically all the beach area south of Cancun all the way to the town of Talum. And if you did any backpacking 10 to 15 years ago, Talum was one of those places, those fabled places that people talked about. You could just rent a hammock for $5 a night, and it's not like that anymore at all, which is very disappointing to some old-time travelers, and I can see why. But it's also an intriguing place to visit if you do have some money now, because the beach there, it's sort of the direct opposite of Cancun. Cancun, I will talk about in more detail because I feel like I have to defend Cancun a little bit. Cancun gets a bad rap because it's very concrete and very built up and very Americanized, and it has its charms, which I'll get to later. But it's definitely like the ready-made resort town. You just show up and the party is there. Tulum is kind of the opposite in that all along the beach, which is a beautiful stretch of beach, probably the best stretch of beach after Cancun in the area. Beautiful beach, and there's still no permanent electricity. There's no permanent power lines along the beach area. So the hotels that are there get by on wind power, solar power. The less ideal ones get by on diesel generators. But the upshot is that very few of the places have 24-hour electricity. So the aesthetic is very like groovy, candlelit, very, very mellow. So even though it's getting more and more built up, you don't really feel it because there's not so much sort of noise and stuff, big ugly architecture sticking out of the forest and stuff like that. It's relatively attractively done so far. There are probably big changes ahead for Talum, but...
And that sounds like it's still less expensive than to... A lot of people would be turned off by, well, when the power turns off.
Okay, I have to admit, I have a troubled relationship with the beach at Talum. I don't know, my budget still does not stretch to easily throwing down $100 a night for a hotel. And then I resist throwing down $100 when I'm not getting sort of all the normal amenities that $100 would get you at a hotel in Mexico, which is usually quite a lot. So in a way, in Talum on the beach, you're paying for simplicity. And I can totally see why this is appealing to people who are really wanting like to clear their brains, total beach escape kind of thing with not an aggressive party. There are a couple really good mellow beach party scenes at various hotels in Talum, but it's not an aggressive
It's not Girls Gone Wild.
Yes, fortunately. Like, I'm not at the level where I would shell out that much for candlelight. There are a couple of places where you can easily, I will not name names, but there are some grossly overpriced hotels on a Tulum beach. So I have a little bit of trouble with it, and I wish I weren't at a point where I could just pay that much money and enjoy it, because it really is a beautiful setting, and some of the hotels there do a fabulous job, and it would be a treat to stay there for 4 or 5 days and, you know, just listen to the waves and not much else. So those are sort of the twin poles of the Riviera Maya, which is what we were initially talking about, the whole beach scene. In between Cancun and Talum, there are a whole bunch of tiny towns, and there is also the town of Playa del Carmen. It's kind of the capital of the Riviera Maya. It's bigger than Talum. It's more built up. It's still pretty low-rise, though. There's a city building code that nothing can be over 4 stories. So you don't have the sort of big towers casting a shadow on the beach the way you do in Cancun. And it's definitely a party scene, but it's a European party scene, and it's also like Mexico City jet setters go there for the weekend.
Interesting, okay.
So it's very like Mexican hipster, which is kind of cool to see. If you're expecting authentic, really, I don't know, authentic indigenous Mexico with everybody in tribal costumes, you're not going to get that, but you'll definitely get like contemporary cool Mexican culture in Playa del Carmen. Some great, great food. They're really good Mexican food, and also there are a whole bunch of Italian expats who have really good restaurants, and lots of Argentinians as well. So Tulum, Playa del Carmen, and Cancun are the big cities, and then there are not big, but they're the biggest points. And then there are lots of little tiny beach towns in between. And that's just the area that's called the Riviera Maya. South of Tulum is this whole other area. There's a big biosphere reserve that takes up a whole bunch of the coast. And south of that is an area that's been dubbed the Costa Maya, just to keep you confused in the terminology. There's a town called Majahual and another tiny, tiny village called Xcalak, and those are kind of the ends of the earth. Xcalak is almost on the border with Belize. And Majahual was unfortunately in the press, I think it was just last year, no, 2 years ago. I lose track of the hurricanes in Mexico. Majahual was in the news because it was sort of right where Hurricane Dean made landfall. I think it was last hurricane season. Fortunately, the Mexican government runs incredibly smoothly when it comes to hurricane relief, and the town is sort of totally back to normal by all reports now. So that's really encouraging. So basically, you can go from like super developed Cancun all the way to like the end of the earth, all along the Caribbean coast. And we haven't even talked about the beach towns along the Gulf Coast.
And which is your favorite?
Well, I'm very, very fond of Playa del Carmen. It kind of, for me, it kind of hits the sweet spot between sort of cool beach retreat. The beaches there are very nice, and actual stuff to do and things to eat. Majahual is developing in a very interesting way. It's kind of on this accelerated development pace where in the time I've been visiting, it went from like nothing, like not having regular electricity, not having phone lines, to suddenly having all that stuff, and then there being a cruise ship pier nearby and people starting up businesses to cater to the cruise ship people. And suddenly there being like one hotel that looked like it should have been built in Playa del Carmen, but springing up on the random totally empty beach in Majahual. So it was a little odd in a way. I haven't been down there since the hurricane. That was the area my co-author updated this time around, and he said it looks fine. I'm very curious to see what made it through the hurricane and sort of how things have changed. The pace of change down there can be a little alarming. So something that people says is a totally remote beach bum area 1 year can change really quickly. People automatically think that means, oh, it's spoiled, but I would say no, like change is not necessarily a terrible thing down there. People are doing really interesting things, and change may mean just more places to eat delicious fish tacos. So I don't really want to criticize it all. I've seen some really wonderful developments in that area in the time I've been going down there. One place that I do really like, and I always wish I could spend more time, is a little place called Isla Holbox, which is actually spelled Holbox, and it's on the Gulf Coast of Mexico, which sort of runs all along the north edge of the peninsula and down along the west coast. The Gulf of Mexico is not nearly as like picture perfect greeny blue as the Caribbean is. It's more sort of a cloudier pale green, so you don't get that like envious postcard scenery while you're lying in your lounge chair. But the water is gorgeously warm and clean, and Holbox is cool because it's this little barrier island. It takes, I never know, it takes like 2 or 3 hours to drive up there from Cancun, and then you have to take the ferry across. And once you're there, there's kind of nothing to do. It's still a sand street, tiny little village. It can't grow that much because it all subsists on one giant generator, basically, and they can't add too much more to the grid, so it's pretty basic. And the thing Holbox is famous for now, and this has happened only in the last 5 or 6 years, is that just off the coast, every like August, September usually, a huge group of whale sharks gather. And these are kind of a rare animal. They are actual sharks. This is terrible. I haven't thought about them in a while. I'm like, are they whales or are they sharks?
No, I think they're
They're
sharks.
Definitely sharks. No, I'm like, no, I was afraid of them. That means they're sharks. But you can go paddling around the water with them and kind of see them up close with your scuba gear on. And they are sharks. They have that like creepy, sharky underbite, but they are actually filter feeders, and they don't have big, nasty teeth. And they're humongous, and they're so calm and beautiful, and they're black and covered with white spots. And it's just a really amazing experience to be able to be in the water with these animals. You're not allowed to touch them. They really don't like that. That's sort of the big tourist drive in Holbox in August, September. The town suddenly gets really crowded relatively crowded with people, and everybody goes out on day trips to see the whale sharks. And then the rest of the year, the other 10 months of the year, there's hardly anyone there, and you sort of have the beach all to yourself, and you can go on these long walks up and down. Or that's what I would imagine you do if you're not a travel guide writer and you don't have to turn around the very next day and take the ferry back out. So it always stands out as one of those places like, when I have real time, I'll come back.
The part of travel writing that we don't really hear.
Right.
So we've talked about the beach, and we talked a little about the ruins. The third thing that you mentioned that always gets my attention, like the ruins because I'm a history buff, is the colonial cities. And I really don't think of the Yucatan and immediately go to colonial cities. So I'm a little surprised always. I don't know why. Tell us a little more about that.
Well, basically the history of the Yucatan is pretty fascinating to me. It developed separate from mainland Mexico, mostly because, geographically it's pretty cut off. It's only connected to the rest of Mexico by this tiny little strip of territory. There was not even a road connecting the Yucatan Peninsula to mainland Mexico until the late 60s or early 70s. The whole territory, in fact, wasn't even an official state of Mexico until the 70s. And the whole territory was much more oriented toward Europe and the Caribbean culturally than it was toward Mexico. So it has definitely Spanish colonial heritage to it, which was huge. But a lot of the wealthiest people in the Yucatan oriented themselves culturally toward France as well. So in Merida, a lot of the grandest old buildings from like the late 1800s are all very French in style, and there's some sort of grand avenues lined with these mansions and things that are really impressive. So you have the French overlay on top of the old Spanish colonial buildings and some of the most huge ornate churches and things like that, which you would see all over Mexico. Surrounding Merida and surrounding each other colonial outpost in the peninsula are the old haciendas, which were huge plantations for henequen. It's a plant that looks like the tequila plant, which is sort of a big yucca, but the fibers of it were used for rope, and basically the whole wealth of the Yucatan grew out of this crop, which the whole world got their rope via Merida for a while, and that kind of took a nosedive once synthetic fibers came in the early part of the 20th century. So you have the structure of the haciendas that dictates the smaller towns surrounding the big cities like Merida and Valladolid. And each little town is built very much the same way. It can be very disorienting to drive from town to town because you're like, wait, I was just here, but it's not quite the same. Like, there's the plaza, and there's the giant church, and there's usually a big ball field, and everything is painted these gorgeous, gorgeous shades in various states of decay and fading, of like really rich ochre and deep red. I know the colors are beautiful, and the architecture is very sort of stark and dramatic. The whole Yucatan is very flat, so you can kind of look out and see these giant churches standing up against the sky. It's quite dramatic. That rural stuff contrasts with the bigger places like Merida and Campeche, and there's also a great town I briefly mentioned called Valladolid. The houses are all really brilliantly painted and all sort of one story with various ornate European architectural details. You have to see to believe. If you've traveled around central Mexico to some of those colonial towns, a lot of it will look somewhat familiar, but sort of the coloring and subtle details are very Yucatecan.
You said that this is the second edition of the guidebook. What has changed in the in-betweening time? What were the noticeable changes?
Oh, man. Well, the big obvious changes are all along the Caribbean coast. I mean,
that's what I wondered.
In the time I've been going down there, Talum has gone from being like a dusty town where you got off the bus and there were like random dogs wandering around and you were like, how do I get to the beach? That's where the action is, I hear. Gone from that to a proper town with divided little central median and sort of side lanes and topiary and a new bus station, and it's really tremendous, and I'm sure it's changed wildly since I was there last, which was only last year. That whole beach area is in a way like really hard to keep track of, and I feel very bad. I do my best as a guidebook author, but these books are only updated every 3 years, so that's why actually I do keep a website, roughguideyucatan.com, where I post, it's sort of a blog format. I just post major changes as I hear about them. So if something's closed or something has changed radically, I do put a note up there. And hopefully readers, when they buy the book, can then go check the website and see if there's anything that needs to be majorly changed in their guidebook before they head out. One of the other things that has changed dramatically to me, though much more subtly to visitors, is the city of Merida. Many of its colonial houses have been bought by expats and by Mexicans and redeveloped. So its downtown sort of has a beautiful fresh coat of paint in many ways, and there are many more beautiful places to stay. And the city has developed a pretty decent art scene as well. So the last time I was there were little gallery shows and some very cool cafes to hang out. Merida, to me, has always had a great cultural scene. There are always, every time I'm in town, there's some kind of great arts festival or contemporary dance or something. But there's a much more palpable young kids doing artistic stuff in Merida, which is great to see. So your trip isn't always all about huge old churches and museums and things like that.
Okay. As we sort of transition to start to wind this down, I know that you're a foodie, so what should we eat when we go to Yucatan?
Yucatecan food is really super delicious. The first thing that's notable about it is the colors of it, sort of the way the architecture is painted, all these rich colors. The food on your plate is also brilliant colors. Yucatecan cuisine uses annatto or achiote, which is a bright red color. It's a seed that they grind up and make into a paste, and it gives everything this bright red-orange color. So you often get pork or chicken or fish cooked in achiote, and then that's usually served with a side of pickled red onions, which are this beautiful, beautiful bright pink color. Then you get the sort of deadly habanero salsa on the side, which is a little red-yellow hit as well. Yeah, basically, people are often afraid of Mexican food being hot, and certainly in the Yucatan, very little is innately hot, and it's up to you to put on the habanero salsa to your liking, which to most people's liking is literally like a drop. I mean,
right.
I'm not exaggerating. As we talked about last time I was on, I'm from New Mexico.
Right.
I know from hot, so I know the chili. I can take it, but even I approach habanero salsa with extreme trepidation. And it can also be a little alarming to visitors because they'll give you like habanero hot sauce in a bottle like Tabasco, but they'll also give you a bowl of what looks like sort of normal pico de gallo, like raw tomato salsa, which I think a lot of Americans think of as the mild option. And it looks totally fine, but it actually has little pieces of habanero in it, and it's really, really deadly. And the Maya word for it that they use everywhere is Xni Pec, which actually means dog's nose, because that's how sweaty it makes you when you eat it, which I love that. So, yeah, if you want to get the nose sweat going, you go for a generous dab of the Xni Pec, but otherwise you want to proceed with extreme caution. I haven't gotten into specifics of what the food is. There is great, great long-stewed pork in banana leaves, which is called cochinita pibil or porco pibil. Really rich, really soulful, super delicious. When you go to the beaches, you get something called chicken chic, which is fish wrapped in banana leaves with the achiote paste, the red achiote paste, and onions, and grilled, so you get a nice, like, rich, smoky flavor on your fish. You get really delicious shrimp tacos, battered, deep-fried shrimp, quick-fried. For some reason, maybe it's the, like, loving the French for so many years, people in the Yucatan are really, really into mayonnaise.
Okay.
So it's actually hilarious. Every time I go into a supermarket, I laugh at, like, how much shelf space is taken up with mayonnaise. It's, like, more than the salsa. It makes no sense. So the shrimp taco is usually served on a corn tortilla with a smear of mayonnaise to sort of hold your shrimp in place. Then you shake on. There's usually a mild tomato salsa for that one, so you don't totally wreck yourself. So there's one place in Playa del Carmen. It's on the highway called La Floresta, where conveniently I always manage to make my trips very inefficient, and I have to drive through Playa del Carmen about 8 times. But every time I drive by, I'm like, great, time for La Floresta, and I stop off and I have a couple shrimp tacos and a cane sugar Coca-Cola, and it totally hits the spot.
Time of year to go.
Typical high season is January through April, and that is when it is just completely beautiful throughout the peninsula. It can get a little bit chilly in Merida. By chilly, I mean like upper 60s, where you might be like, wait, I signed up for like a tropical vacation, but I have to put on a sweater. And people in Merida complain bitterly when it's like upper 60s in January, but they're all wearing their huge turtleneck sweaters and things. And that's also the dry season. Like, you shouldn't encounter any rain. If you're going to go stay in a slightly expensive thatch roof room on the Talum beach, definitely do it in that season. Once you get into May, it starts getting noticeably hotter. It's going to be like lower 90s and really humid, and you might start getting a little rain. And the rain really kicks in regularly by like July. It's not all-day rain usually. It's usually like a really strong rain shower for about 45 minutes in the afternoon, which is not too much to disrupt your travel plans. If you're driving, you probably want to pull over because it's often so strong that you can't see. I was initially, the first time I went down there, a little concerned about road conditions during the rainy season and things being washed out. But pretty much everywhere you want to go, the roads are fine. There's only one notoriously terrible road that you can't do in the summer. I know from bitter experience. From Talum, if you drive south from Talum into the nature reserve that's there, there's a tiny, tiny little town at the end of this horribly, I cannot exaggerate how bad, potholed road. Like, literally, like, I always rent the teeniest car, like the thing that now has replaced the VW Bug in Mexico for the most part. Teeny, tiny car, and, like, I'm driving down into potholes that I feel are big enough my whole car fits in them. I had a total disaster driving down. This tiny town is called Punta Allen. So if somebody says to you in the course of your trip planning, go to Punta Allen, middle of nowhere, great beach getaway, it is. It's a fabulous, like, nothing to do but lie in a hammock kind of town. But you basically can't reliably get there outside of that dry season, like January through April, because the road is just too terrible. I once did manage to get down there in my rental car, and then there was a terrible rainstorm, and I could not get out. I had to hitch a ride on the beer truck, which I don't recommend anybody have to do for their regularly scheduled vacation. I kind of prefer going down to the Yucatan in November. The rainy season winds up. Some people can also call that the hurricane season. The risk of hurricanes kind of starts in August and goes through October. If there's not a hurricane, it's like no more dramatic than your regularly scheduled rainy season afternoon rain. If there is a hurricane, you could still have a perfectly nice time, and somewhere 2 hours down the coast gets battered. It's very hit or miss. Like I said, the Mexican government is like a well-oiled machine when it comes to dealing with hurricanes, and nobody should stay away from Mexico because they've heard of hurricanes there. I can't emphasize, like, they really have it down to a science. That said, I would not book your honeymoon on the Yucatan Peninsula on the beaches in early October, mostly because a lot of the really nice hotels know best, and they just close for a month and give all their staff a break. But once the hurricane rain sort of lines up, that usually things kind of start drying out by early November. And by the end of November, it's gorgeous, gorgeous. There are hardly any tourists down there. Not that there's ever a huge crush of tourists outside of the beach areas, but you really do have a lot of the archaeological sites, a lot of the Maya ruins totally to yourself in November. It's no problem getting a room in your favorite hotel and that kind of thing. So fortunately, a lot of my research trips have coincided with November. Prices really spike right around Christmas holidays, but you can usually get great deals in November and December because it's not the prime tourist season quite yet, but you have a lot of the benefits of the weather.
Okay. As we wrap this up, the best day you've had in the Yucatan?
Best day I've had. Ooh, it's hard to narrow down. And now, of course, all I'm thinking of is my, colossal bad trip down to Punta Allen that one time. Even that, turned into a great day because there was the beer truck there and the guy was happy to drive me. Hard to narrow down. It would have to be a day where I got to stop at La Floresta for the shrimp tacos. Although, just as I'm saying that, I'm also thinking of one time when my husband came down to visit me on one of my research trips. He just came down for about 3 days while I was in the vicinity of Merida, and we just had a great time driving the little back roads in that Ruta Puc area I was talking about with all the little ruins. Driving around down there, and people are so gracious and polite in the Yucatan. Pretty much any encounter you have with somebody is going to be incredibly heartwarming. The thing I'm thinking about on our trip was actually we were driving back up, and I was about to drive to the airport and drop Peter off, and we realized, we have time for lunch. Where should we stop? I don't know. And we had been driving toward the airport and happened to see a little sign for home cooking basically stuck out in front of somebody's house. And so we drove into this little residential neighborhood and stopped and had a little lunch at this woman's house. People are pretty enterprising, and they'll just put out their shingle as the home cook person. And what they're usually doing is making meals to sort of people arrange to have them delivered to their workplaces, or they'll stop by with their Tupperware and they'll get their lunch and take it away. But this woman had a couple tables set up in her front patio. And we just had a great talk there with the one other guy who was having lunch there. And he was a doctor and just a really sweet guy. And he spent a little bit of time in the States. And just the random encounters. I mean, I've had so many random encounters like that, which I guess is the essence of traveling anywhere. But I really feel like the kindness and politeness of people in the Yucatan is really exceptional. And sort of the local pride. And if you can work in any Mayan words, people are very pleased. What I love about the Yucatan is the Maya presence there is huge. And even if you are somebody who doesn't really have any Maya lineage, you still use Maya words very commonly in your speech and take a great deal of pride in that local indigenous culture, which I haven't traveled much in central Mexico, but I get the impression it's much stronger. That sort of pre-Columbian culture is much stronger in the Yucatan than it is elsewhere in Mexico, and it's a great thing to see.
If you had to describe the Yucatan in 3 words, what 3 words would you use?
Well, it's a little bit of a Mexico cliche, but the Spanish word tranquilo, which means tranquil, is really what it's all about. And it's funny, people who live in Cancun will be like, oh, you're going to Merida, you're so lucky, it's so tranquilo there. And it's like, well, Cancun is actually not that crazy, but I guess compared it is. Oh, which reminds me, I never got into my huge defense of Cancun, but briefly, do not write off Cancun. There is a huge amount of Mexican culture there if you know where to look. There's nothing historical to see there because it was all built in 1974 and later, which in itself is a totally remarkable thing. Like if you're interested in urban development and urban planning, Cancun is totally fascinating. The more you look, especially in the hotel zone, the more you'll see that it's as used by local Mexicans as it is by tourists. And there are so many great little, tiny hidden away fish places and things like that in the hotel zone, which at first glance just looks like tourist mayhem. But actually it's a pretty surprisingly integrated and mixed situation there. Anyway, so Cancun. Cancun, compared to Merida, is a little bit frenetic, and Merida is sort of the ultimate tranquilo city. More than 1 million people live there, and you would never know it. It feels like a small town once you get down to the main plaza. I would also describe the Yucatan as romantic. There's a beautiful, beautiful style of music that is particular to the Yucatan. The Yucatan was very influenced by Cuban music. And there's these old romantic ballads that are just sort of heartbreakingly beautiful, and people sing them all the time. You can hire your own romantic crooner trio to serenade you if you want. They're all over the place. And it's not like a touristy thing where they berate you in restaurants. They're just there, ready to sing incredibly romantic music at the drop of a hat. And sort of in that romantic vein, you see older couples and young couples, like everybody is always sort of sitting on benches, staring dreamily into each other's eyes. So if you are going, I always warn people who are going down there with like platonic friends, just, proceed with caution. This setting may get to you. Tranquilo, romantic. I would also say really rooted. Like I said, the Mayan culture is still so strong there, and there's this tremendous pride in that really influences everything and just gives a very good feeling to the place, and the continuity of history is really impressive. It's really, really rich, and I feel so lucky to have been given what started out as a slightly random assignment, and feel so lucky to have been able to get to know a place so well through my research, through my guidebook research. And I can't wait to go back. I think I'm going back probably next March will be my next trip. So I'm really looking forward to it.
Our guest again has been Zora O'Neil, talking about the Yucatan and her new book, The Rough Guide to the Yucatan. Zora, thank you so much for coming on the show, sharing your love of the Yucatan.
Oh, my pleasure. I just hope I inspire some other people to go and enjoy it as much as I have.
And I'll have links in the show notes to Zora's various blogs. I think you've got 3 or 4, as I recall, from our last talk.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, like I said, Rough Guide Yucatan is the one. If you do buy the book, definitely go to the website, roughguideyucatan.com, and look for sort of major corrections. Fortunately, there's only one thing up there right now, since the book just came out November 3rd, but there's always that lag between doing the research for the book. The last time I was down there was February. There's always that lag between researching the book and the book coming out where something goes wrong. You're like, oh, the restaurant closed. It was so good. So there's that, and then my personal website, rovingastronome.com. But you'll put the links up, I trust. So.
Zora, thanks for being on the show.
Great. Thank you so much.
Normally at this point, we talk about an internet resource and we do some news from the community, but 1, this has been a long show. 2, it's after midnight as I record this, and 3, I'm losing my voice because of a cold, so we're going to wrap this one up. Next week we do have a show on Zanzibar, and the week after that on Acadia National Park in Maine, so stay tuned for both of those. If you have any questions, feel free to send them to host@amateurtraveler.com or post a comment at amateurtraveler.com. Also check out the blog.amateurtraveler.com, which used to be the old Tripinator blog. I'm hoping you're enjoying that change and some of the new writing that I've been doing there as well. As always, thanks so much for listening.
I got to see one more cathedral. I got to sit in one more cafe.